Okay, David, most people are here, so if you're ready to go, we're ready for you too.
Welcome, everyone. My name is David Converse, and I am the president of MWA. And we're very happy to have you all here tonight to listen to our symposium on leachate. MWA is very proud to be hosting this symposium, and are dedicated to the protection, resiliency, and enjoyment of Lake Memphremagog Watershed. Conversations about leachate has many pieces to it, and we're hoping that this evening's event provides a better understanding of the sources of leachate, how complex it is to manage, and the complexities in disposal. It is a spirit of collaboration and education that tonight's event is offered. We're thankful for the panelists who are here tonight to lend us their expertise and insight, and we're appreciative to all of you in the audience who are taking the time to learn about and address the topic of leachate. At this point, I'd like to introduce our moderator for the event, Jennifer Nauer. She is a professional facilitator contracted through the MWA and will help us keep the conversation on track and productive. Jen, thank you.
Thank you, David. And Bevan, if you wouldn't mind watching the weight room and letting folks in as they come in, that'd be great. Thank you. Hi, everyone. So yes, my name is Jennifer Nauer. Good evening and welcome. And my job is to help us stay on track and with the agenda and to queue up questions. I am a facilitator by trade and definitely not an expert in leachate, but hopefully by the end of this evening, we'll all know a bit more than we did before. So to that end, I have a couple of logistical notes. An outline of events. We've got a agenda here. You can see it's pretty full. So we'll set up the presentations from our panelists in two batches. The first round will be around what leachate is and how it's generated, regulated. There'll be a brief period for Q&A, clarifying questions for those first three panelists, and then a second round, and that's more about the technologies available for managing leachate. Another batch of Q&A, but and we'll probably, let's see, I'm trying to estimate the time for you, but after an hour goes by, so at the top of this hour by 8 o'clock or 8:30 at the very latest, hoping to move into question and answer. So there's ample room to ask your questions, and we'll take that and pace it as we can. There's lots of ground to cover, as you can see. So what you can expect from me, so that we're all able to visit as many questions as possible this evening. A couple things to anticipate. First off, let's see, sorry about that. Look at that. So first off, panelists, and a note to everyone, we're asking an awful lot of them. They have a ton of information to prepare, and we've asked them to condense it into a really short time frame. So with that said, and with deep appreciation for the challenge, panelists, what I'm asking you to do is to do your best to stay within the time frames that we've set for you. If you go over, you'll see me wave a piece of paper and just share that says time. Doesn't mean we want you to end right away, but to take a minute to wrap up your thoughts so that we can transition to the next phase. And participants, we'll pause periodically for a question and answer. And primarily we'll take questions on air, but the chat is also available to you if you prefer to type them in. So if you have a question while listening, jot it down. Please know that we'll do our best to keep an eye on questions that are raised in the chat, but we probably won't get to all of them, and I may not even be able to go in chronological order. So know that what I'm going to be doing is paying attention to match questions with topic moment to moment to moment. Up until 2 p.m. today, there was an option on the registration page to submit questions in advance if you had them. And so if you put a question there, we have taken them into account and we'll queue them up as the night goes on. 2 more points. Time will fly by. And so I'd ask you to, with that in mind, focus on the questions you have rather than keep commentary to a minimum. So with that said, if you have a concern, you can always say, I'm concerned about with the topic, and what I'm wondering is, and then ask your question. So to the best of our ability, we'll be able to tap into the expertise of the panelists here tonight. All right, wrapping up the logistics. A lot of you are probably accustomed to Zoom. However, in case you aren't, I just want you to know where your control frame is. You'll notice that the microphones and the videos are not turned on right now. And that's by design, but as we get into the Q&A, you'll have a few more options. During Q&A, I'll ask for a show of virtual hands. So you can go ahead and try to find yours now. If you are on the phone, *9 will raise your virtual hand. And if you're online and you jiggle your mouse over your Zoom screen, you'll find raise your virtual hand under either the reactions tab or the participants tab. And if you want to try that now, I'll see how many of you are able to actually find it. Doesn't mean I'm going to call on you. Just looking for, there you go. Yeah, I'm just looking for some awesome evidence that you're able to chime in. That's great. Thanks so much. So again, it's going to be *9 for folks of you on the phone, and raise your virtual hand either using the participants tab or the reactions tab for those of you online. Nice work. If you have any technical questions, you can put them in the chat and I will get to them as soon as I am able. So David or Mary Pat, before we begin with the panelists, is there anything that I've missed or that you'd like to add at this point before we begin?
Oh, I think I'm good.
Okay. All right then. So for our first round of presentations, it's really Leachate 101, right? So how Environmental Protection Agency and the State of Vermont approach leachate management. And so our first panelist is Kaithan from the Vermont Solid Waste Program at the Agency of Natural Resources and the Department of Environmental Conservation. So Casey, I'm going to go ahead and spotlight your video, and you can begin your presentation when you're ready.
Thank you. Are you seeing my video and presentation?
We are seeing your presentation, but not your video yet.
Okay. If you're able to turn that on for me, Jen, that would be.
Yeah, I'll do my best. You can start going to your presentation and I'll see what I can do from this end.
Sure thing. Let me know if it doesn't work.
Yeah.
I think I actually just found it. Sorry. All right. Thank you, everybody. I do want to reiterate all of the thanks that just came from both David and Jen. I appreciate everyone being here to learn more tonight and just to participate in this discussion. I am Kaithan from the Vermont Solid Waste Management Program. I've been with the program for the past 8 years, and I've been closely involved with the permitting and oversight of many waste management facilities in the state, but specifically all of our landfill facilities, both closed and operating. And I get the pleasure of leading you through just a very brief introduction to landfill leachate to make sure that we're all on the same page for the conversation tonight. When it comes to leachate here in Vermont, we define leachate within our solid waste management rules, and as you see on the screen, essentially it's any liquid passing through or emerging through solid waste. And this is inclusive of everything that then gets transported by that liquid, both the organic and inorganic components. Leachate's produced at our transfer stations, compost facilities, and landfills. Tonight, we're certainly going to be focusing primarily on landfill leachate for this conversation, but it's important to keep that context of other waste management facilities in mind for this conversation. For municipal solid waste landfills here in Vermont, leachate is currently required to be collected by a double liner system at the base of the landfill, where the waste, which would be at the top of your screen in this area, is directly underlain by material that allows the leachate to drain through the granular drainage blanket, through the waste, and then onto a non-permeable geomembrane, where it then collects and is moved to the lowest portion of the landfill, or the sump. Immediately below this system, it's repeated, and that's the secondary liner. Again, a drainage unit underlain by a geomembrane, which will collect any fluids that potentially make it through that first liner system, and those liquids are similarly collected in the sump. A photo of the recently installed sump at the New England Waste Services of Vermont landfill in Coventry is shown at the bottom of the screen. And you'll note those large riser pipes that are being constructed going off onto the right-hand side there. Those are where the pumps can be installed that will then remove the collected liquid. If you were to be able to look below those liners, you'll see here it's noted as a compacted subgrade. That compacted subgrade is material, on-site material that's met specification is then densely compacted to be, again, as impermeable as possible. Below this, so if we look, here's our screen bedding soils going down in depth. This is the compacted subgrade. There's another drainage layer down below that compacted subgrade. This is the underdrain system. This underdrain system is constructed to move any groundwater away from the landfill. And the liquid collected by the underdrain system should not consist of leachate because it's been isolated by the liner systems above. So we have two different fluids that we're talking about discharging from the landfill. There's the leachate that's been in contact with the waste, and then the underdrain system discharge, which is isolated below the waste system. For leachate, beyond the regulations on construction, which serve to have the leachate collection systems in place, and those are managed through the solid waste management rules, there's other factors that influence the quality and quantity of the leachate that's being produced. As you might expect, waste produces leachate for a really long time after its disposal. Leachate produced by old waste does tend to be weaker with time. Leachate produced by mixed waste, like those accepting municipal solid waste, the New England Waste Services landfill is a municipal solid waste landfill. That's residential waste. Those landfills tend to have very complex leachate compositions and variable leachate compositions than those that may accept more limited waste types like monofill landfills or ash landfills. And then the individual site characteristics also are going to impact the leachate composition and certainly the quantity. One of the main goals after disposal of the material becomes trying to minimize the production of leachate and minimize any liquid getting into that waste. So at disposal, this may mean blending wet wastes with drier wastes and ensuring sufficient compaction of the waste material. Following disposal, this means considering covering the waste effectively and promptly, and ensuring that the appropriate run-on and run-off controls are keeping the clean precipitation and leachate separate. And these systems are in place to minimize the leachate that's ultimately produced. But that leachate is still going to be produced following disposal, and it does require management. What I've presented on the screen here isn't an exhaustive list of the management options that may be employed, but I do think they kind of highlight the primary ones. In some parts of the country and the world, the water balance favors using evaporative lagoons to decrease the quantity of liquid leachate that's produced, and these have been heavily employed in those locations. Other locations utilize recirculation, where the leachate is then pumped or sprayed back into the landfill waste mass. This serves to speed up decomposition and gas production, but with it comes a suite of potentially complicating factors like odors and freeze-thaw issues in places like Vermont. Vermont currently is not approved by the EPA for leachate recirculation. The other combination below of biologic, chemical, or physical treatments is what different treatment systems that you might typically associate with more standard wastewater treatments. For this reason, many landfills have on-site wastewater systems that are targeted at managing their own leachate, or they're directly plumbed for discharge to a wastewater treatment facility, or like in Vermont, they haul direct to a wastewater treatment facility and discharge the leachate into the system at that facility. In Vermont, when we discuss landfill leachate management, we really are talking about two options. Our old historic landfills, which were constructed prior to the 1992 Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA amendments, which was what required the lining of the landfills, are discharging straight to groundwater. And there are a number of those in Vermont. In most cases, that older waste mass is showing declining leachate strength with time, and contamination has been monitored to ensure that it stays on the property. But there certainly are impacts to groundwater across the state from these unlined systems where there's a direct leachate to groundwater interaction. We only have 5 landfills that were constructed following those 1992 amendments and have those constructed liner systems that I went over earlier. Those 5 landfills all remain actively collecting and transporting leachate to wastewater treatment plants, even though a number of them closed throughout the 90s and early 2000s. And this fundamentally expands our conversation beyond the landfill system itself and into these potential downstream relationships and impacts, which means that we need to understand what's in the leachate and other industrial wastewater systems and residential wastewater systems and how they all might be interacting. And that's where the wastewater pretreatment programs start picking up regulation instead of the solid waste management program. And you're going to be hearing more from them in the presentations that are going to directly follow this one. Like I said before, we know that leachate can pick up whatever's in the waste mass along its way to the landfill sump. In addition to some of the more standard inorganic metals or organic contaminants, the world of contaminants of emerging concern, or CECs, is something that we are now addressing. On the screen, you'll see some broad categories just from one study's evaluation of CECs and landfill leachate. There's numerous examples out there that have looked at this. These categories are very broadly lumped and with numerous contaminants within each of those categories having been evaluated in the work. You'll note that all of these categories were detected in the leachate. And those with the higher red bars were detected most frequently. Those with the blue bars, though, the higher the blue bars, showing the percentage of total concentration. In this study, household chemicals made up the largest percentage of the total measured concentrations. Again, each individual landfill is going to act somewhat uniquely in terms of the composition of CECs in the leachate. This was a study of 22 different landfills. And that relationship between CECs and material disposed, age of the waste, and all the factors I previously raised is going to contribute to what the individual landfill's leachate profile looks like. But it is going to reflect the contaminants that were in the original waste stream. If we are to focus in on a single contaminant of emerging concern, one that certainly raises to mind and that will be addressed specifically throughout the presentations that are to follow this evening is per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS. Here in Vermont, PFAS were first analyzed at any location in late 2016. And like the image on the screen shows, that early investigation primarily focused on just a few compounds at the top of the triangle. In that early phase, those few compounds were PFOA and PFOS, which we're probably all familiar with at this point. But as investigation in Vermont, around the country and around the world, expanded beyond those preliminary investigations and out of the yellow and orange into the other colors at the base of the triangle, the world of PFAS contaminants has expanded. In Vermont, 5 compounds, again, just in the yellow and orange portion of this triangle, are what are regulated. These 5 compounds, along with others, have been detected in all leachate that's been sampled in Vermont from all of our 5 landfills. And again, this brings us to that necessity of trying to understand the relationships between an entire PFAS cycle. Under our current operational system, the active Vermont landfill is managing leachate at a wastewater treatment plant. So we have a direct connection from landfill to wastewater treatment facility. We're actively working to try and understand the impact that this has on the wastewater treatment facility and in the context of other potential PFAS sources, industrial sources and residential sources, and how changes in those systems can be made to minimize downstream impacts, and how that will, again, relate back to the other portions of the cycle. It's a complex problem that in many ways, despite the rapid expansion of the work in this field that has occurred in the last several years, we're still in the beginning stages. The series of presentations this evening will pick up the story there and hopefully inform this group as to how we're currently operating and managing with this knowledge of CECs and trying to figure out the relationships between landfill, leachate, and wastewater treatment facilities and what some of our options may be moving forward. So with that, I'm putting my contact information up here. I'm sure it will be available following the presentations this evening. I'm glad to talk to anyone at any point in time, and we'll turn the presentation over to Jay Pimpari next.
Yeah, Jay, while you are queuing up, Jay comes to us from the Environmental Protection Agency. He's the Regional Pretreatment Coordinator in the New England office. And Jay, we can see your shared screen, but we might not be able to see your video quite yet.
How's that?
Looks good.
Great.
Do you want your video on as well?
Sure, if you can put it on, please. I do have the video on my end, but if you can put it on your end, it's up to you.
Okay, go for it.
Thank you. So as mentioned, my name is Jay Pimpari. I'm the Regional Pretreatment Coordinator at EPA for New England. New England I do cover the entire 6 New England states. I'll explain a little bit of the oversight responsibilities with the industrial pretreatment program in the state of Vermont. So I just want to give you a little backdrop, a little bit about how the federal government and EPA provides oversight and management of landfills currently now, and some potential regulations that may be coming down the line in the future. And then lastly, just kind of wrapping it up, I was asked to talk about the Pfas Roadmap that EPA has put out. And I do have a bunch of links in here. So if I start to talk about a guidance or a guideline or some acronym that only people that work for EPA can remotely understand, just click on some of the links here and that will take you there. So just to step back a little bit, the pretreatment regulations of EPA were promulgated in January of 1981. Seems hard to believe that prior to 1981, industrial discharges to not only the sewer system and to lakes, oceans, rivers, and streams were unregulated for the most part. And the picture you see here is probably pre-1981 as well, just of an individual, and you could probably find 1 million OSHA health and safety violations as a result of that. So I want to fast forward a little bit now and to the point, and I will talk about the landfills and how we regulate them, but let's just talk a little bit about the oversight responsibilities in the state of Vermont. Vermont is a unique program. When I say unique with respect to the industrial pretreatment program, they're only one of 5 states that operate under this, what's called the 40 CFR 40310E state-run program. And again, traditionally, the 45 other states is that the local municipality, or the POTW, that's the publicly owned treatment works. I'll use that term quite a bit. The POTW is the local wastewater treatment plant. The local wastewater treatment plant takes responsibility for the oversight of its industrial users. But in the promulgation of the pretreatment regulations back 1981 timeframe, Vermont decided and put in a plan to become delegated on their own. So what that means is that in the absence of a local pretreatment program by the local POTW, the state performs all of the what you see here on the screen, all the permitting, all the inspections, all the sampling and the monitoring, and all the enforcement, should there be a need to escalate enforcement of all of the industrial users. Now, again, so the state of Vermont has oversight responsibility for the industrial users that discharge into local municipalities and wastewater treatment plants. And EPA is always out there. We do perform audits of the state program. I believe the last audit was done in about 2018. We try and do these audits every 5 years. It was a very helpful audit. I think we all learned a lot. And I've been working with Nick Giannetti quite a bit. Now, again, that's not to say that in the absence of a local pre-treatment program, a local municipality could not independently develop a permit and do the inspections and do sampling and do perform these activities that are much more stringent than the state. So I've said this all along. If you listen to my presentations over the years, I think it would be in the best interest for municipalities to also have some form of oversight of your industrial users within the state. So landfills, yes, EPA has promulgated 40 CFR 445 in January of 2000, almost more than 20 years ago now, regulations on landfills. The final regulation did establish technology-based effluent limitations for wastewater that is discharged to receiving waters of the United States. So those are ocean. So if you are a landfill and you discharge to a, lake, river, ocean, stream, creek, wetland, etc., there will be national categorical standards across the board. However, the final effluent guideline regulation only applies to landfills that discharge into these receiving streams. It does not apply to landfills that discharge into a wastewater treatment plant or a publicly owned POTW. EPA concluded way back when, pre-2000, that these POTWs had could adequately treat the pollutants in the landfill, and the landfills did not cause operational problems, etc. Now, again, that determination was made pre the year 2000. So there are detailed studies ongoing. We have what's called the Effluent Guidelines plan from EPA. We have 1 year, we have a preliminary plan, and next year we come up with a final plan. The most recent plan was signed in September of 2021. You can see the link here if you want to click on that and find a little bit more about it. I did emphasize some there. So what EPA does is basically look at all these ancient rulemakings that go back to the 80s, 90s, and 2000 to say, wait a minute, have things changed in the industrial sector now, whereby we should revisit this and there are new additional pollutants that should be regulated. And so we've come up with new rulemakings for such things as steam, electric, etc. But jumping down, you'll see that we have decided that there will be a landfill leachate PFAS study. And what that means is that we've identified landfills as a potential source of PFAS. The public comments identified landfill leachate as a source of PFAS. The preliminary review results show that future research is needed to address that. We will continue to gather information, and we will be doing a detailed study in the next, or as of now, in the years to come on landfills. And basically, what does that mean? So as part of a detailed study on the landfills, we are looking for data. Anybody out there in the general public that has data on any of these items, please feel free to submit that to EPA. You can do that through the link that I just provided you through the Effluent Guidelines program. We're looking at things such as current size and scope of the landfills that generate wastewater. We just learned that the landfill leachate obviously is one of the main sources of water that's generated from the landfill. Any analytical data you may have for a PFAS, PFOA, and PFOS seem to be the two PFAS compounds or pollutants that are commonly found from the landfills. We're looking for a profile of the indirect discharging landfills. These are the landfills that discharge into wastewater treatment plants, and looking for any amount of wastewater gallons, how many gallons per day they discharge, and any impact on the POTW influent and effluent PFAS concentrations. And then lastly, as part of this detailed study, what we're looking for is any current wastewater control practices and treatment technologies in place at these landfills. And if any of the landfills are currently implementing PFAS treatment for its leachate. And so again, if you have any of that information, please submit that per the Effluent Guidelines plan. A couple more quick slides here. EPA has come out with its strategic PFAS roadmap. Our administrator, Michael Regan, back in October announced the agency's PFAS roadmap. There is a link to that down below here. It is a great webpage, a ton of information to be provided. And basically, what the goal of the roadmap is to just lay out a whole agency approach to addressing PFAS. I do want to say that EPA has a commitment to tackling PFAS pollution and protecting the public health and the environment. EPA is committed to taking action to better understand and ultimately reduce the potential risks caused by these chemicals, including how to safely dispose of and clean up PFAS in the environment, and certainly to address PFAS contamination in water. EPA's actions to address these chemicals will be underpinned by science, and will support the agency's efforts to develop effective regulation and provide improved public health protection for all Americans, and not only in Vermont, but for across the country. So as we look at these types of reviews, we're trying to ensure that environmental policies, discussions, guidance, and regulations, the impact and protect the lives of fellow Vermont's and Americans are informed by the best available science, and that these decisions rest on a strong foundation of science. Again, there is the link below. We're again committed to listening to the public and working together with our states, drinking water and wastewater systems, and local communities that have been impacted by PFAS to identify flexible and pragmatic approaches that will deliver critical public health protections. And then lastly, really the three themes here of the roadmap, the three R's. My Boston accent wants to keep telling me it's the three R's, but they are R's. It's research. We're invested in research and development, methodology, innovation, understanding PFAS exposure, remediation, in the fact that if there are sites that need to be cleaned up for PFAS, we can accelerate those cleanups. And then lastly, but really most important here, with the protection of the industrial pretreatment program and the NPDES program, that's to restrict. It's to pursue a comprehensive approach to proactively prevent PFAS from entering air, land, and water at levels that can adversely impact human health and the environment. And really, EPA, we just want to bring a deeper focus to preventing PFAS from entering the environment in the first place, a foundational step to reducing exposure and potential risks of future PFAS contamination. A couple of specific programs targeted for restricting PFAS are the Industrial Pretreatment Program and Effluent Guidelines Program, which I just previously mentioned, and evaluating specific industrial sectors in order to determine an effective approach to restricting pollutants from entering our nation's waterways is basically the first step to prevent PFAS from entering our environment. And so with that, I know we'll take questions later. I will stop sharing my screen and turn it back to the audience.
That's true. You can turn it back to the community. That is a lot of information all at once. Jay, thank you so much. So we are moving through an awful lot of information really fast, but after this next presentation, we can take a moment just to breathe and check in with all the panelists and ask some questions then. So Nick Gianetti, you are up. Nick comes to us from the pretreatment. He's from the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources. Let's see if I can get this right. The Department of Environmental Conservation. And you are, Nick, the pretreatment coordinator for the state. So when you're ready.
I am sharing my screen now. Slightly frozen, so hopefully that will.
And if it doesn't work out, I will come in with what I've got for a version so that you can still have a visual up.
It is actually frozen.
You know what? I'll go ahead and I'll share the PDF that I have. You can just tell me when to move to the next slide. Does that work, Nick?
Let me just try it once more. Okay. Looks like.
You got it.
There we go.
Nicely done.
Can you see that okay?
Yeah, we can see it fine. It looks great.
Great. Welcome everyone. Thanks for attending, and I hope you're all well. My name is Nick Gianetti. I'm the section supervisor of the pretreatment section of Vermont's wastewater program. Been with the program for about 6 years, and today I'm going to talk about Vermont's pretreatment program, what it is, how it works, and how it relates to landfill leachate. As you know, in Vermont, leachate is hauled to wastewater treatment facilities, municipal wastewater treatment facilities, and that's where the pretreatment program comes in. And I only have 10 minutes here, so I'm going to go through a lot of information pretty quickly, and I hope I don't run out of time, but so please bear with me, and I'm happy to take any questions at the end. So Vermont's pretreatment program is not actually a program. It's a section in the wastewater program, which is in the Agency of Natural Resources, the Department of Environmental Conservation's Watershed Management Division. And it lives in the wastewater management program. And the wastewater management program has two sections. There's pretreatment and direct discharge. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those today and what they do. And the wastewater program sits in the Watershed Management Division, because it's critical to supporting the Watershed Management Division's mission to protecting, maintaining, enhancing, and restoring the quality of Vermont's surface waters. And we do that by regulating discharges to surface waters. So the two sections in the program work together to protect surface waters. Pretreatment is a regulatory permitting program focused on discharges of process or industrial wastewater to municipal wastewater treatment plants. So the pretreatment section lives upstream of a municipal wastewater plant, whereas the direct discharge section is a regulatory permitting program focused on point source discharges of wastewater to surface waters. And that program covers both municipal wastewater treatment plants and industrial facilities. As Jay mentioned, Vermont's program is pretty unique, where the state actually implements the pretreatment program. So we are permitting the users connected to the municipal wastewater plant. We're only one of 5 states that do that. All the other states, the pretreatment program is implemented by the municipal wastewater plant. And that municipal wastewater plant is responsible for permitting those industrial discharges. Just a little bit about the direct discharge section. As I mentioned before, it permits and regulates discharges of wastewater to waters of the state. It implements the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System program, otherwise known as NEK-TVs, and that's EPA's program that we're delegated to implement. They look at discharges to surface waters and ensure that they meet the Vermont water quality standards. And they would do that through a discharge permit that incorporates water quality-based effluent limits and technology-based effluent limits to ensure that discharge meets the water quality standards. In a permit, you're going to have routine monitoring and reporting requirements for proper operation and maintenance of any treatment systems, and the program does compliance and enforcement on those permits. Just a quick note on the water quality standards. There's a lot in the water quality standards, and there's numeric water quality standards, narrative standards, and the discharge and anti-degradation policies. And all of those get looked at and applied at any discharge to surface waters. Another important note here is that any application for a new discharge to surface waters would have to come into this section via an application for a direct discharge permit. So a direct discharge to surface waters needs to be covered under a direct discharge permit and can't be covered under a different type of permit. So the pretreatment section, as I mentioned, regulates discharges of industrial or process wastewater to municipal wastewater plants. A permit would incorporate technology-based effluent limits or local limits, which are site-specific limits to ensure pollutants do not pass through or interfere with the municipal wastewater plant. Our pretreatment permits also adopt municipal requirements because we are permitting a discharge to a municipal wastewater plant. The municipal wastewater plant is the owner of that plant, and so they may have certain conditions for the users on their system. So we incorporate those in our permit. And similar to the direct discharge section, we would have proper operation and maintenance conditions in the permit, require monitoring and reporting, and perform compliance oversight and enforcement. We also do annual inspections of our facilities. So as I mentioned before, Vermont's pretty unique, and our intersection with the direct discharge section in collaboration with municipalities allows for a very strong, proactive program that we can be responsive to potential or future or further impacts to surface waters in the environment. You know, we can work with the wastewater treatment facility and target pretreatment efforts to address issues seen at the wastewater plant. We can also incorporate municipal conditions to support the municipality's needs. And on the direct discharge side, if the direct discharge program identifies effluent limit violations or receiving water issues, pretreatment can respond by going upstream of the wastewater plant and identifying and controlling those sources of pollutants. So when I say pretreatment, I mean regulatory requirements to control, reduce, and or eliminate pollutants from non-domestic sources of wastewater. Pretreatment doesn't always mean the implementation of a pretreatment system, like a wastewater treatment system. It could mean implementation of best management practices to reduce wastewater strength. It could mean limits on flow or control of the volume of wastewater that's discharged to control the to limit the mass of pollutants introduced into a wastewater plant. Could also mean certain operational requirements to prevent pollutants from entering the wastewater. And the level of pretreatment that's necessary is site specific, and it's dependent on the capacity of the receiving wastewater plant and the needs of the receiving wastewater plant and their surface waters. The primary goals of the pretreatment regulatory program are to prevent the introduction of pollutants that will interfere, pass through, or be incompatible with the municipal wastewater treatment plant, improve opportunities to recycle wastewater and sludges produced at the wastewater plant, and to protect municipal wastewater workers. The two terms, pass-through and interference, are really important, so I'm going to drill down on those two. Pass-through is a regulatory term, and it means a discharge that exits the wastewater plant into surface waters and causes a violation of any requirement of the wastewater treatment plant's NEK-TV permit. So that's pretty important because these two terms, pass-through and interference, are related to our authority to control and regulate pollutants. And so we have the authority to regulate discharges that have the potential to pass through or interfere with the wastewater plant. So that's why these terms are so important. So pass through is it's exiting the wastewater plant, causing a violation of an effluent limit at the wastewater plant or a violation of a surface water quality standard. Interference is a discharge that can inhibit or disrupt the wastewater plant and cause a violation of the wastewater plant's NEK-TV permit, or prevent sludge from being disposed of in accordance with the wastewater plant's disposal procedure. And these two things that are really key here are that both of these conditions are tied to a violation of a standard. So where it's a violation of a NEK-TV permit standard, or a receiving water standard, or a sludge standard. And where there are lack of standards, such as with pollutants of emerging concern, it's very challenging for us to regulate those due to the lack of standard. So those are two terms that I just wanted to talk about, because they're the basis for our authority to control discharges. Just going to skip ahead here so I can stay on time. This is the universe of pretreatment in Vermont. We have 24 municipal wastewater plants receiving wastewater from permitted industrial discharges. We have 44 permitted industrial users. 34 of them we called significant, which means that they pose a significant risk to the wastewater plant or surface waters. And with those SIUs, or significant industrial users, we do routine inspections, annual inspections for those. We evaluate about 25 new discharges per year, which is quite a bit. We also have a source reduction and pollution prevention program. And we also are administering a funding initiative through the American Rescue Plan Act, where we're looking to fund pretreatment projects. And the different types of industries we review and regulate are dairies, a lot of food and beverage manufacturers, metal coating facilities, landfills, lots of breweries, cheesemakers, and some textiles. So now that I gave you an overview of the permitting program, I'd like to tie this to leachate. And with leachate concerns, as Casey mentioned, leachate contains a variety of different conventional, non-conventional, organic, and inorganic pollutants. And with leachate, we're really concerned with pass through the wastewater plant at concentrations that cause a violation of receiving water quality standards, interfere with sludge disposal options by the municipal wastewater plant, and interfere with the operations of the municipal wastewater plant. In Vermont, leachate's collected in a storage tank and hauled to municipal wastewater plants. There's a storage tank on your left here and a headworks receiving area on your right. And those tankers would be driven to a permitted municipal wastewater plant, and they would discharge the leachate from a tanker truck into the headworks of the plant. And usually the wastewater plant has an equalization tank that stores the leachate, and they blend that leachate into their wastewater treatment process over time. So in Vermont, currently we permit one active landfill, which is the News Vermont landfill in Coventry. That permit just came off public notice, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with that permit. We also permit leachate collected from Casella-owned transfer stations around the state. We also permit leachate discharges from 4 closed landfills. Those are Moortown, Chittenden Solid Waste District, Randolph Landfill, and Springfield Landfill. And the conditions that you would expect to see in a pretreatment permit for landfill leachate include site-specific limitations on volume of leachate and quality of leachate that can be discharged to the wastewater plant, routine monitoring for flow, conventional pollutants such as biochemical oxygen demand, total suspended solids, and pH, monitoring for nutrients, monitoring for metals, monitoring for organics such as volatile organic compounds and semi-volatile organic compounds, monitoring for pesticides and PCBs, and currently we are proposing monitoring for PFAS. Other conditions you can expect to see in a typical landfill pretreatment permit are oversight of the design, construction, operation, maintenance of any pretreatment systems that are that treat the leachate prior to discharge to the wastewater plant. You can expect to see non-compliance notification and response requirements. So if the permittee was to exceed a limitation or violate a condition of the permit, they are expected to report that violation within 24 hours and implement a corrective action that includes immediately stopping the violation and implementing actions that would prevent the violation from recurring. There would also be some general conditions that require the reapplication of a new permit when their permit expired. And another really important permitting condition that we have is monitoring at receiving wastewater plants. So any wastewater plant that receives the leachate, we require specific monitoring at their wastewater plant and at the surface waters to assess the impact of that leachate on the wastewater treatment plant systems and the surface waters. So those are really important tools in our toolbox to ensure and assess how the leachate is affecting the wastewater plant. We're doing a lot of work on PFAS in leachate, and I'll just quickly give you an overview of this, and then this is my last slide.
Could you feel me starting to move in?
Yeah, I can't see your
Yeah.
video though, but I heard you breathing.
That's really funny. This is Jen. I'm the moderator again. So Nick, if you could tie up on this slide, then we'll go to questions and see what people are really wondering in detail.
Will do. Yeah, so I couldn't give a presentation on leachate without talking about PFAS, and I just kind of have a brain dump here of the work that we're doing on PFAS. Currently, a lot of this work is proposed in the News Vermont pretreatment permit that just came off public notice, and these conditions are proposed because that permit is still draft and we are in the process of considering public comments. But just in summary, we are proposing monitoring for PFAS in leachate at their receiving wastewater plants and in receiving waters that are for those wastewater plants. In the News Vermont permit, we're proposing a pilot study of a pretreatment system, which many of you know. In the past, we've looked at a conceptual scoping study, which looks at treatment systems for leachate treatment systems for emerging contaminants. We conducted a third-party review of that study to evaluate that study's reasonableness. We are actively conducting surface water and fish tissue sampling for PFAS, and we're also implementing a plan to publish a water quality standard for Vermont's 5 PFAS by 2024. So all of these conditions are proposed and kind of in progress, and they're really going to define, once they're finalized, they're going to define what future pretreatment permits will look like and future pretreatment regulation of landfill leachate will look like. So with that, thank you. And my contact information is here, and I will share this presentation also. So thanks a lot.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's take a couple of questions. That means, well, I have a couple that were submitted in earlier on for the 3 panelists who were just presenting. So that's Justin and Casey and Nick. I'm going to actually ask you all to come back to the screen for just a moment so that we can see you. Here's a quick reminder for the audience. If you do have a question for the panelists, *9 on your phone will raise your virtual hand, or you can jiggle your mouse over the Zoom screen and under the participants tab or the reactions tab, raise your virtual hand there. Nice to see you all on the screen. That's a lot of information. And so while we're waiting for a couple of questions to come in, I do have a couple general ones if you're ready to field them. And not in any, they're in sort of an order that I was just looking for plain English language because I was trying to follow some of the detail and was absolutely losing you in some places. But here's one. Once leachate contaminants enter a body of water, can they be easily removed?
I can take that one.
Mm-hmm.
So That's a really hard question. Remediation of surface waters isn't totally my area of expertise. And I'm happy to forward this question to our toxicologists and our lakes, ponds, and rivers experts, so they can follow up and give you a more detailed answer. But essentially, how a contaminant behaves in a surface water varies widely depending on the contaminant. Some contaminants settle or bind to the soil. Some may stay suspended in the water column. Some may transform and break down over time, while some may be more persistent and bioaccumulate in fish and wildlife. And those are important factors to how the contaminant would be removed from the surface water eventually. So that's my comment on that question. Like I said, remediation of surface waters really isn't my expertise. And I'm happy to forward that question to our toxicologists.
There are a ton of questions to cover, but Casey or Justin, would you add anything to that?
No, I think all I would say is that stay tuned for the second half of this presentation, because I think that you'll learn a little bit more about the different types of treatment technologies that are out there. This first half was more of a overview of the regulations, etc. Yes, there are means of treatment, and you'll hear a little bit more in the second half.
Well, so here's one that you may or may not have an answer to, but I'll ask it. Also submitted in advance. Why is any level of leachate in a lake considered safe?
I can address that one.
I'm sorry, Nick.
No, it's fine. So I just want to clarify that no leachate is being discharged directly into a lake. In Vermont, leachate is discharged to a wastewater treatment plant where it's treated and disinfected at the wastewater plant. And then that wastewater plant discharge is, or effluent is discharged into a surface water.
All of which we'll actually talk a little bit more in the next round of presentations.
Yep. And so yes, the wastewater or effluent coming out of the wastewater treatment plant does contain some levels of pollutants. Some of them are from the leachate. Some of them are from a combination of sources. And our water quality standards establish the levels of contaminants that can be present that are safe for surface waters. And when we look at a discharge, we look at the upstream concentrations of a contaminant. We look at the downstream concentrations of a contaminant, and we look at the contribution of the contaminant by the discharge. And if the constituent meets the water quality standards, then that contaminant is allowed to be discharged in those levels, at those levels. So that's my answer.
Casey, there's a question for you, and then I wanted to take one on air. And this may not be the right time for it, but what disposal options do exist for landfill leachate other than releasing it into waterways was the second half of that question.
Sure, Jen. I think, I touched on that a little bit in the presentation with talking about evaporative lagoons and recirculation within landfills. Even in those systems, there's some sort of liquid leachate component that needs to be managed, ultimately the residuals after those treatment processes. In some cases, it is a disposal back into a landfill system, but often it is some sort of relationship with a wastewater treatment facility for those residuals as well. There are other unique treatment systems for very specific landfill situations that I didn't touch on here that can not have that relationship with a wastewater facility and may not have direct discharges. But those three that I touched on are the big ones.
Let's take a question on air. And Terry Lucas, you'll be able to unmute now if you'd like to ask your question.
Thank you. I'm sorry I missed a little bit of the earlier discussion, but Nick was mentioning that there are 30 or 40 industries that are producing leachate that's being processed by these municipalities, and only one landfill active in the state of Vermont. of all the leachate that's being released, how significant or how problematic is the concentration of stuff in the landfill versus the other industries? And you mentioned also 25 violations. What kind of industries are having those violations? Are they the landfill or are they other industries?
Thanks for the question, Terry. So just to clarify, we have 5 permitted landfills or discharges of leachate from landfills to municipal wastewater plants. Our other 40 or so permits are for other types of industrial discharges. So they may be from other industries, such as we have a lot of breweries, metal finishing facilities, food and beverage manufacturers, dairy facilities that are, we permit other industrial discharges, not just leachate. So that was the first part of your question. The second part of your question regarding violations. I don't recall the 25 violations, but when there is a violation from a permittee, whether it be a landfill or whether it be a brewery, we follow up with a series of compliance actions. And our first action is seeking voluntary compliance. So we expect the permittee to to address the violation immediately, notify us of the violation within 24 hours. They have 5 days to tell us how they've addressed the violation and stopped the violation. And they are also expected to implement corrective actions to prevent the violation from recurring again. And so that's kind of like the standard non-compliance response. If violations recur or if a violation is significant enough, we will issue them a notice of alleged violation, which is basically a step towards a formal enforcement case on that permittee. And if the permittee fails to comply with the notice of alleged violation, or if they continue to violate, or if their violation was significant enough, we will pursue a court order against the permittee. And that court order may have fines, and it may have penalties for the violations, and it may also require specific corrective actions. So that's kind of like the different steps and different levels of the enforcement process. And we have a procedure that we use to identify when a violation is significant enough for us to pursue enforcement. And an example of that would be if a industry discharged something toxic to a wastewater plant and it upset the wastewater plant, and now the wastewater plant was discharging partially treated or untreated wastewater to a surface water. In a case like that, we would pursue a formal enforcement action, which would involve a court order and penalties and fines and corrective actions. And those documents are called an assurance of discontinuance or an administrative order. And those are signed by State of Vermont court, environmental court. So that's what we do in response to a violation. And anyone who is in violation, it's called significant non-compliance. We post their name in the newspaper. So we do essentially public notice those entities that are in chronic non-compliance. You had one other part to your question, and that was related to leachate quality and how it compares to.
Go ahead, Terry.
Yeah, that's right. I was more interested in the in terms of, I assume not all leachate is the same. Some's a lot worse than others. Is landfill higher than that, or is it in the middle? Is it at the lower level of leachate?
The leachate quality differs from each landfill, and it depends on what sort of wastes have been disposed of in that landfill and how young or old the landfill is and whether or not that landfill is capped or still open. all of those things affect the quality of the leachate coming out of the landfill, and that's eventually discharged to a municipal wastewater plant. And I think from what we've seen, the active landfills tend to have higher concentrations of contaminants compared to the closed landfills. They also have a higher volume of leachate. And yeah, you know, that's how they compare. I'm happy to share some data on that. Casey, do you have any?
Yeah, no, I think you covered it, Nick. I mean, I think we're in a little bit of a unique situation here in Vermont because we only have the one active landfill and our other landfills are closed and capped and not getting fresh precipitation in. So the active landfill certainly has a much more variable composition of leachate because of those environmental factors that are impacting it. And it is just a much larger system than the other closed landfills, which are much, much smaller in scale. I think if you were to look at NewsVT's leachate composition in the context of other similarly sized active landfills, it's not unusual.
One other point there.
And it will need to be a quick point though, because
Okay.
because it's past, so we're getting past 8. Go ahead.
Leachate quality compared to you know, the quality of other industrial discharges, let's say from like a brewery or a dairy facility. Leachate is much more contains much more toxic chemicals, toxic organic chemicals, toxic inorganic chemicals, contaminants of emerging concern, and in some cases higher concentrations of conventional pollutants, such as like BOD, BOD. So, you know, leachate is, it does contain a lot of stuff in its wastewater.
Well, here's a question to transfer with. So the next 3 panelists can start to gather themselves for their presentations, but a quick answer if you had one to something that came up in the chat. Why does it take so long to establish standards, e.g. 2024? My guess is it's complicated, but if you had any other insight into that, why does it take so long to establish standards to sort of normalize what it's trying to go through in order to create something?
Yeah, there's a long data collection period. It's very expensive, and it requires representative monitoring of surface water concentrations for the pollutant that you're trying to establish the standard for. It requires monitoring of the of different species of wildlife and aquatic biota and fish to determine what are safe levels or toxic levels of that pollutant in that certain organism. And it also requires data on the impacts of that pollutant on public health through drinking water and through consumption of wildlife and fish. And with a new contaminant, we don't have a lot of that data. Also, the methods are developing. So it takes a while to get methods where we can get good data, reliable data. And so, you know, you need good methods, you need good data, you need lots of testing, and that's and money to pay for that testing. And that's a poor explanation of why it takes so long to create a standard. But
well, what it does is it illustrates what some of the activities are that are going on during that phase of time and the wait.
in our
Justin, Casey, Nick, I am going to move on to the next bunch of panelists. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. We'll come back with a larger Q&A at the very end, but thank you very much for this little break. Okay, so this next round of presentations is about the technologies for managing leachate. It might start to answer some of the questions that are popping up in the chat that we haven't gotten to yet. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the spotlights here of some of our panelists that went earlier. And Rick Burns, you are up. And if you'd like, I can share your screen. So Rick Burns from NTH Consultants, if you could introduce yourselves to us, I'll go ahead and pull up your screen share for you. Are you still here?
Trying to unmute there.
Yeah, I know.
Sorry about that.
It's okay. It's nice to have you with us. Do you want me to go ahead and share the presentation?
Sure. Start with the title slide, please, Jennifer.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead and begin talking and I'll open it right up.
Okay. I'm Rick Burns. I work for a consulting company. It's been in business for over 50 years. We specialize in waste management projects, landfill design, leachate management, that sort of thing. I wanted to put our presentation of why folks from Michigan are even participating in this discussion. We've been working on PFAS issues in Michigan, I think, since 2017. And the PFAS issue came up and potential threats to water supplies at a couple different facilities in Michigan. A shoe manufacturer, Tanneries in Western Michigan, that was using PFAS. It was Wolverine Worldwide, which makes hush puppy shoes, for those familiar with that product, as well as some of our operating military bases that frequently used aqueous firefighting foam, or also known as AFFF. And because we were just coming off the lead issue in Flint, Michigan, which had, I think, worldwide attention. To our credit, our Department of Environment, which is called Michigan Department of Environment, Energy, and Great Lakes, EGLE, clever acronym, was quick to react to the concern about PFAS in water, because I think mostly due to what we dealt with in Flint. So because landfills were a focus, because that's where we dispose of most of our consumer goods that contain PFAS materials, the Michigan Waste and Recycling Association, which is a group of landfill owners, haulers, transfer station operators, including national firms, Waste Management, Republic Waste, Waste Connections, and several smaller regional organizations, decided to get ahead of this and see what the extent of the issue was for their leachate, which is disposed at our wastewater treatment plants. Next slide, please. So our study, funded by Michigan Waste Recycling Association, included solid waste, or municipal solid waste facilities, or what we call Type 2 here in Michigan. And as you can see, Michigan, consists of two peninsulas, the Lower Peninsula and the Upper Peninsula. We had 32 members participate and provide us data for their leachate volumes annually, as well as their associated wastewater treatment plant or other disposal facility. And what I wanted to do, our study is very extensive, and I wanted to focus on simply the volumes that are typically produced at our landfills, as well as how it's disposed. So as you can see from this southern half of Michigan is where most of the landfills are located, which makes sense because that's where most of our major cities are located, including Detroit metropolitan area to the far east, Grand Rapids, Michigan to the far west, and Saginaw, Midland, and Bay City, pretty much just below the thumb. We were able to, in addition to the 32 member landfills, we were able to get information from 3 municipally owned landfills, as shown in the blue dots here. Hang on for just a second. Trying to get to it. So what I want to focus on, like I said, is just what is it, the volumes that we deal with every day, and where does it go? I did want to note that when I was getting ready for this presentation, I was surprised to learn that Vermont, your lake there, was similar to Michigan. We share along the Upper Peninsula boundary Lake Superior with Canada, as well as Lake Huron on the east side. one second. The next slide, please. So as you can see, leachate volumes shown on this graph vary quite a bit across the different landfills that we studied. And they typically range from less than 5,000 gallons per day to approximately 125,000 gallons a day. As you would expect, larger landfills generate more, smaller landfills less. Most of our large landfills, as I just indicated, are located near urban centers, which are conveniently located what we call water resource recovery facilities, which has been referenced as wastewater treatment plants in previous presentations. The total annual leachate generated from Michigan landfills every year is about approximately 400 million gallons of water, which is a lot, but small in comparison to the total amount of influent that wastewater treatment plants receive. As a previous presenter indicated, landfills employ a variety of methods to mitigate landfill leachate development because it represents one of the most significant operating costs. This includes impermeable daily cover application, leachate recirculation. Waste has quite a bit of absorption capacity to store leachate. They try to limit the working face. Leachate is formed, as you know, from precipitation entering the waste. And if you can keep the working face as small as possible, it reduces the total volumes. A lot of emphasis on best management practices for stormwater, and some facilities implement spray irrigation systems. Next slide, please. This pie chart demonstrates how leachate is typically disposed in Michigan landfills, and it's pretty common distribution elsewhere in the country based on our research. The ideal situation is if you have a direct sanitary discharge, which represents about 50% of how wastewater is disposed from landfills, and that's direct discharge to wastewater treatment plants. It's followed by what we call pump and haul. There was a nice visual presented earlier, where you actually discharge to tanker trucks and haul it away to either a publicly owned wastewater treatment facility or a commercial wastewater treatment facility. Those two combined, commercial and the pump and haul, represents approximately about 50% of the methods used to dispose of leachate from Michigan landfills. There's one facility that has a direct surface discharge. It's really a treatment system of reverse osmosis, which removes PFAS and other contaminants. And then what's growing in popularity is deep well injection. And some facilities use one or more of these different methods to dispose of their leachate. Evaporation, a previous presentation discussed evaporation ponds. What's somewhat popular here in Michigan, especially in the northern reaches or more remote, is to use the landfill methane from landfill gas to reduce the leachate volume basically by boiling it off and evaporating, because the distance to wastewater treatment plants of any kind from those distant landfills is quite long and very expensive. Since we published our report in 2019, deep injection wells have become more popular. At the time, there were 2 large landfills with permits to discharge to deep into geologic formations, and that's how they handle their leachate disposal. Additional 3 wells are proposed at other places in Michigan because it's a very expedient way of getting rid of waste leachate, PFAS included, without having to work through a permit at a wastewater treatment plant. But I do note that deep wells are very politically contentious, and they're only possible where geologic conditions are favorable. So I think that is all I wanted to say, and it segue into the next presentation from Ann Tevelier, my associate from the state of Michigan Department of Environment.
Thanks, Rick. Ann, are you able to join us? You might have to. There you go. I'm going to pull you up onto the screen if you're ready.
Okay.
go ahead.
And you're gonna share the presentation?
Yes, I will do so while while you begin.
All right, well, thank you for having me. Like Rick said, I am from Eagle, Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. And I'm gonna talk about how Michigan used the industrial pretreatment program to identify industrial sources of PFAS and how wastewater treatment plants are controlling those discharges. And Michigan is one of those many states where the municipality is actually implementing the industrial pretreatment program rather than the state of Michigan.
I know
Jen,
you're waiting for those visuals. My fingers are not clicking fast enough, but here you go.
Okay, and you can go to the second slide. Thanks. And so there are a number of potential approaches to addressing pass-through of pollutants to waters of the state from wastewater treatment plants. And we chose to focus on finding sources through the industrial pretreatment program rather than first screening treatment plant effluent, because we were concerned that we would miss sources due to dilution or the intermittent nature of some industrial discharges. And also, it is really more effective to eliminate and treat at the lower volume concentrated source rather than at a wastewater treatment plant, which has a higher volume and is much more dilute. And so industrial sources are generally discharging from a range of around 5,000 to 400,000 gallons a day, while treatment plants generally discharge 500,000 gallons to upwards of 50 million gallons a day. Next slide. So Michigan is really unique in this situation because we do have PFAS criteria for our surface water. And that's why we can implement this industrial pretreatment program. And so this table shows our PFAS surface water quality values for PFOA and PFOS. And we are currently working on revising our PFOA value, and we are assessing the potential for PFHXS and PFNA to build up in fish tissue so that we can derive human health values for those two PFAS this year. And I want to note that the PFAS surface water criteria is so much lower than PFOA due to the bioaccumulative nature of PFAS in fish. Next slide. So the Industrial Pretreatment Program Initiative was launched in February of 2018. And at that time, we had 95 wastewater treatment plants with approved pretreatment programs. For the initiative, we asked the treatment plants to look for sources of PFAS within their collection system. And so the treatment plants were required to evaluate their industrial users and other sources such as contaminated sites as a potential source of PFAS. They were then to conduct follow-up sampling of those probable sources. And then they were required to sample treatment plant effluent if the probable sources were discharging above the screening criteria, which we used as 12 parts per trillion for PFAS, which is our water quality value for PFAS. In addition, if the treatment plant effluent came back of greater than 50 parts per trillion of PFAS, the wastewater treatment plant was required to sample their biosolids for PFAS as well to ensure that there was no interference occurring with their biosolids handling. And so the reports were being submitted in 2018 and 2019. Next slide. So in August of 2020, we compiled all the industrial user data that was submitted through the initiative, and we released a report detailing the identified industrial sources of PFAS to waste. And so we refer to it as the source doc. And this table here is a summary of our findings, and it represents our best efforts to compile, organize, summarize the information we had at that point in time. And so that's essentially what that little footnote number 1 is saying. And so as I mentioned earlier, we define source as those exceeding the screening level of 12 parts per trillion for PFOS at least once. And in terms of impact on the wastewater treatment plant effluent, it really depends on factors such as the size of the wastewater treatment plant and the PFAS loading from each industrial source and how much dilution is occurring in the collection system from domestic wastewater. Next slide. And so there are ways to remove PFAS from a waste stream. And these examples here include both industries that are discharging to wastewater treatment plants and those that are discharging to lakes and streams here in Michigan. And so these systems are able to allow the industry to meet local or state PFAS requirements. And so as for landfills in Michigan, we have 2 landfills that were able to modify their existing GAC system, or granular activated carbon, that were used to treat for PCBs. And so by modifying that system, they were then being able to treat for PFAS. We have 1 landfill that is using a powder activated carbon system to treat for PFAS. And another landfill has recently constructed a PFAS treatment system using GAC and resin. And in addition, some landfills are undertaking best management practices to reduce the volume of leachate generated that they then discharge to the wastewater treatment plant. The next slide. And so this slide here is to show that reducing PFAS at the industrial source is the most effective way to reduce PFAS coming from a wastewater treatment plant. And so these wastewater treatment plants listed here, they have been able to achieve these reductions in PFAS due to PFAS pretreatment being installed at the industrial source. And it's taken a lot of time and effort for our industries and our wastewater treatment plants, but to work together to make great progress to reduce PFAS discharges in our surface waters of the state and Michigan. And I also wanted to touch on another initiative we started as a result of the IPP PFAS initiative. So in Michigan, a landfill can discharge to a wastewater treatment plant that doesn't have a pretreatment program. And so because of this initiative, we know landfill leachate contains PFAS. So now we're requiring any wastewater treatment plant that doesn't have an IPP, but accepts landfill leachate, they're required to do a short-term waste characterization study, which basically means they have to sample the leachate and sample their treatment plant effluent when they're processing leachate to ensure that they're not having any pass-through or interference, which are those terms that Nick talked about earlier. Last slide. And so again, thank you for having me. I just wanted to leave you with some additional information on the IPP PFAS initiative. Appreciate your time.
And thank you so much. That was a lot of information. And we are again going to pause for questions for the 3 panelists, but we have 1 more to go. And so Amy Dindal, I'd like to invite you up to the virtual stage that we have here. Amy joined us she's the Environmental Research and Development Director at Patel Memorial Institute. Amy, are you all set? Looks like you are.
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, sounds good.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Jen, and thank you everyone for hanging on for this last presentation. I see there's still lots of folks online and we really appreciate your interest. I'm going to continue here talking about technologies and treatment possibilities and really exploring what's coming down the road in terms of future technologies. So as Jen said, my name is Amy Dindal. I come from Patel, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization based in Ohio. So again, coming to bring information to you Vermonters about PFAS treatment technologies and really appreciate the opportunity to do so. I wanted to talk first a little bit about PFAS and why it's so challenging to treat this suite of compounds. The things that make these compounds so useful and how they are applied is what makes them difficult to break down. They contain a very strong carbon-fluorine bond. They're chemically, thermally, and biologically stable, which means they won't degrade on their own. And as we've heard about this evening, there's the presence of co-contaminants that can make it challenging. Oftentimes, PFAS will be there in collaboration or in contamination with other contaminants, and that is why makes it difficult to select a treatment technology at times that will be able to isolate those PFAS and treat them. Another one of the challenges, as you just saw in Anne's presentation, is the concentrations that we're working towards. Ideally, you're working to things that are non-detect levels, but regulatory limits that are in the subparts per trillion range are very low levels. And so that's another challenge with treating these technologies. But what we're going to talk about now is how we see the pathway to doing so. You just heard Ann talk about a couple of these technologies that are already in utilization. So things like granulated activated carbon and ion exchange resins. These are things that are used to treat and remove the PFAS from the matrix that they are treating. There's also some novel adsorbents that are similar to those that are being used and that are out there. There's some new techniques to do physical separation, like foam fractionation, where you actually separate the PFAS into that foam layer. The PFAS like that air surface water interface. They go into the foam and you can scrape off the foam and then you can treat that foam. You have other things like reverse osmosis that'll reduce the volume significantly and concentrate it down. All of those techniques that you see in the top two green boxes are things that are non-destructive. As you heard Ann say too, these are things that have been used for other things. So there are technologies that have been used for PCBs, for example, that we found then can also be used for PFAS. So they're pretty well understood in terms of how they can be utilized because they've been used for other things. The challenge with these technologies is that they do create another waste stream. They create a secondary waste stream that then requires treatment and or disposal. So where the future of technology for treatment technologies for PFAS really have been driving towards is with complete destruction. And you can see here a number of things that fall into these categories, things that you may have heard about, things in the thermal realm, like incineration, or there's a smoldering technology, which does involve an increased temperature. The real innovation is starting to come in these redox manipulations, or where the chemistry is changed so that there is an impact to the oxidation state also changing, and therefore actually manipulating and changing and breaking down the PFAS chemicals. A number of these technologies like plasma and electrochemical will use an electric current or electrodes in order to create that oxidation. Other technologies use things like increased temperatures and pressures in order to get it into that oxidative state. But that is really where the focus has been in terms of developing these destructive technologies because of the challenges with those current technologies that we have that are non-destructive. So what we see is that often these technologies can and will be used in combination so that they can complement one another. In some situations, there are treatment systems that are already in place, such as those GAC and ion exchange situations that Ann just talked about. We can use a destruction technology after those non-destructive techniques so that we then achieve the ultimate goal of PFAS destruction. But the challenge with those technologies is they haven't been applied yet. This is fairly new research in some cases that's coming on, coming about to learn more about these technologies. I know there was a question and the questions ahead that were sent about the effectiveness. Are there any breakdown products? Are there residuals? Those are all important questions that have to be looked at with each of these technologies as they're being brought online. Another thing is cost. That's a very important component. Right now, the cost for traditional disposal methods is up in the, I've seen citations of up into the $30 per gallon range to destroy and actually treat through things like disposal or incineration. So there's, their cost is increasing for things that contain these PFAS chemicals. So it is highly important that we come to these solutions, ones that aren't energy intensive, ones that don't create another product or a byproduct as a result of that treatment, and ones that are able to handle the co-contaminants that are there with the PFAS chemicals. So we're going to focus on just one example, just to give you a sense of one type of technology that's coming as a new technology for treatment of PFAS, and that is supercritical water oxidation. And there's a little graphic here. I know one of the questions was, how do these technologies work? So just to give you one example, this is one where you're going to increase the temperature and the pressure such that you get into this supercritical state, and that is a place that enhances the oxidation. So once you get the leachate into the supercritical state, you're going to add an oxidant so that we can then break those CF bonds. After that, there's a neutralization chemical that's added so that when you come through the end product, you have PFAS-free water along with some inert salts and some carbon dioxide. This is one of those technologies that has been looked at by the EPA. Last year, and well, it was actually 2 years ago, in 2020, EPA formed a PFAS innovative technology treatment team, and they looked at a number of technologies. You see one of their research briefs there on supercritical water oxidation. This is one where they had put some focus in terms of something that looked very promising for the treatment of PFAS. There was a number of others, like electrochemical was another one that they had highlighted. In 2021, they looked at this technology and published a journal article on use of supercritical water oxidation for the treatment of AFFF, which is a highly concentrated PFAS matrix, as you heard one of the other speakers mention earlier. So it is one of these technologies that does have the attention of EPA and others as we look to it. And why is there interest in this technology for the treatment of landfill leachate? Well, for one, it is not a new technology. It's a technology that has been around and has been utilized to treat other difficult to treat compounds. It's something that can happen very quickly. Once you get into that supercritical state, you have a very quick residence time, something that you have a quick 10-second reaction. So it's something that's very effective in treating PFAS very quickly. Another thing about this technology is it is agnostic to short chain and long chain PFAS. So it doesn't matter if it's one that has a small number of carbons or a large number of carbons. It's going to break that CF bond once it gets into that supercritical state. I know there was a question that was said ahead about the waste and the byproducts. That's a critical component to look at what else is being generated as a result. And with a technology like this, where you're breaking those CF bonds and creating the mineralization, that's where you're going to minimize your waste to things like these inert salts like sodium fluoride. That'll be able to be part of that waste stream that's generated, and things that aren't going to be harmful. Another thing that we heard a lot about, especially early on when we were talking about the leachate and what's involved with the chemical, other co-contaminants, you want a technology that's not going to be inhibited by those co-contaminants. A technology like this actually uses some of those co-contaminants as fuel. It uses it to actually increase the temperature that involves the reaction time and actually increases the reaction time. So it's something that's not inhibited by the co-contaminants. And it also works effectively for dilute and highly concentrated media. And you see landfill leachate is something that kind of checks a lot of those boxes, looking at co-contaminants, a very dark, murky matrix, as you see there, that can be treated by supercritical water oxidation, whether it's highly or dilute concentrations of PFAS that are there. So just to wrap up, we heard a little bit about the PFAS resources that are available from EPA. Jay talked about those. There was also a mention in Casey's presentation that actually she referenced some of the documents on the ITRC website. If you want to get more information about PFAS, fact sheets, videos, very comprehensive information, ITRC is an organization that most all the states belong to, so there's a lot of good information out there, and it's meant to really educate as well as share new findings on new technologies. So it's something that's really helpful if you ever want any information. And another resource to look at is DoD's CERTA BSTCP program. You can see by the graphic there on the left that DoD has been investing in technologies for PFAS treatment and otherwise for the last several years, and there's a lot of good information there as well. So I thank you for your time tonight and look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. Let's bring some of your other panelists up to the screen so that you can batch a couple of answers. Here's what I'm noticing in the chat is that all of this information, well, first of all, it's a lot of information. So it's a lot to take in. But also people are wondering what it means locally. And I know with this particular group, I'm looking at folks who are coming from out of state, but I still think you have really important perspective to share for what it means in state. So you might be able to take some of these comments and just help us find that perspective for what it might mean for Lake Memphremagog. Rick, if you're still here, I'm looking, there you are. I want to bring you up too. You can go ahead and unmute, Rick, because I know that you're trying to save bandwidth and not turn on your video. So again, some of the comments in the chat are about those chemicals that bioaccumulate. Is that the right word, right? So people are worried about fish or they're worried about where it's showing up. And so to that end, there's some comments and questions there about how do you even assess, and is there adequate testing at the surface, at the bottom, at all these areas? Here's a question for any of you to answer if you can. What is the best way to analyze leachate to determine all the harmful chemicals, in addition to PFAS, that should be addressed? And maybe it's hard to say the best, but if you had an approach to that question.
Well, if hopefully you can hear me, I think
Can hear you fine.
Yeah, the approach we're taking right now is pretty intensive in terms of trying to characterize leachate, landfill leachate. Some things we don't test for. We're testing for PFAS now, which was not even on our radar a few years ago. And we're catching up with these emerging contaminants. So there's not a single test, it's a multiple tests that are necessary to fully understand what's in leachate. I'll just throw out pharmaceuticals, which there was a slide earlier tonight. That's not something we test for, but many of those pharmaceuticals also pass through wastewater treatment plants. So yeah, there isn't a single test, but it's a family of tests, including herbicides and everything else you can imagine. Leachate is a very complex, one of the most complex fluids that we deal with anywhere.
Rick, here's a question that came, and you might be able to pick this one up on. It came up as a pre-registration question. What is the most comprehensive method to determine the chemical composition of the Coventry leachate? I know that's very Vermont specific, but go ahead.
No, it's not actually. It's common. It's a question common across the country. But like I just said, if they're asking for a specific test, there are specific tests for PFAS, and there's, as you know, I think it's been mentioned, there are thousands of PFAS compounds. The only ones that we really know anything about was a list of about 35. Amy, Ann, would you agree with that? And we continue to get more information, and the toxicology is behind our ability to see these compounds in any kind of water, leachate or otherwise.
A related question, and I think you touched on it in your presentation. What contaminants do current leachate pre-treatment systems remove, and which contaminants are not removed?
I think Nick kind of talked about how, landfills, not all of them are requiring a pre-treatment system installed at the actual landfill. And I think even Jay talked about why EPA decided that we weren't going to set effluent limit guidelines for landfills that discharge to wastewater treatment plants, because it's, landfills or wastewater treatment plants are built to handle conventional pollutants like ammonia, BOD, suspended solids, and phosphorus. So oftentimes if a landfill is treating for something, it will be for metals or PCBs. These are things that the treatment plants are not designed to be able to treat. That's when a treatment plant would require a landfill or any industrial source to install treatment at the facility.
Here's a question that's coming up on the chat, and then I will recommend anybody who's sitting on a question right now for this particular group of panelists, you can raise your virtual hand either by pressing *9 if you're on the phone, or raising your virtual hand during the reactions tab or participants tab on your computer. A question, in relation to PFAS in the environment, is there a way to tell the difference between PFAS compounds that are ubiquitous, for example, present through atmospheric deposition, and PFAS that are from point sources, such as landfill leachate?
Jen, I can take that one. So there are technologies that are out there, analytical methods that can look for a broad range of PFAS, and then that can help with understanding the source and where they come from. So typically it's high resolution mass spectrometry, which can scan using a suspect screening library for up to 500 PFAS in some cases. To Rick's point, they're not quantitative because there's not standards available, but you can qualitatively look at those compounds. So the question being, look at differentiation from different sources. You have to employ those higher analytical techniques in order to accomplish that.
Don't know how jumpy this transition is, but another question, how likely can I don't know if this is PFOS or PFAS, if there's a difference there, pass through the two liners of a correctly built landfill?
I'll take a stab at
Yeah,
that.
thanks.
Yeah, just it's a timely, good question. And recent studies completed by the Geosynthetic Research Institute out of Drexel University and others indicate that those plastic liners that are used in the liner system are very effective in preventing or mitigating transfer of any PFAS through them. It makes sense too, because if you think about it, PFAS compounds are pretty large chemicals, and it takes a small chemical, very volatile, which PFAS are not, to penetrate a liner system.
Amy, I'm guessing this question goes to you, but any of you can pitch in. Given that leachate has been released or is being released in Memphremagog, what can be done, if anything, to fix the leachate in the lake?
So a similar approach to treating in the environment would be taken to, as well as treatment in, at the source, at the landfill itself. So these techniques that we talked about, both non-destructive and destructive techniques, would be utilized. Nick talked about the approach to addressing an environmental situation. So it's a similar process.
Okay. There's a lot of questions. Go ahead, Rick.
Well, yeah, I just wanted to try to put people's mind at ease
Yeah.
for Vermont Lake. Again, somebody pointed out, leachate is not being discharged to the lake, right? It's pre-treated. Wastewater treatment plants cannot remove certain compounds. So yes, some of these compounds, PFAS in particular, end up in the lake. Just as a corollary, in Michigan, we're surrounded by water. The Great Lakes, we are not seeing PFAS in the water itself, our drinking water supplies from the Great Lakes, but we're seeing it in the fish, which is a testament to the bioaccumulation properties of these compounds. So what that could result in fish advisories to not eat certain quantities of fish, but it's not like I don't believe it's a critical mass right now for PFAS. And your lake is very large, not as big as the Great Lakes, but it's good. The concentrations that you're receiving right now are not going to directly affect you because they're so low. If we drop the part per trillion down to part per quadrillion, which is on the horizon, we might be able to see them. But again, what does the toxicology say? And right now, it's those concentrations that would be in your lake are relatively minor and not really a cause for concern, except for with the flora and fauna that are bioaccumulating those compounds.
So it's so interesting. I bet that's actually sparking other questions for folks who are online. So I'm going to remind you, if you're watching, you can raise your virtual hand either through the reactions tab or the participants tab, or jiggling your mouse over your thumbnail. Others of you on the phone can *9. One more or two more questions to this crew, and then we'll bring on all the panelists and see how you might answer those questions generally, because I think there are a couple more that are going to come in. Amy, this is a question specifically that maybe you've already answered, but maybe you can just highlight what the answer was. Some of the effective low-cost methods of treating leachate for PFAS.
Yeah, I did try to address that, but certainly is an important question because the low-cost method is important. So Anne mentioned the GAC and the ion exchange resins. The cost of those adsorbents themselves are a few cents per 1,000 pounds. I mean, they're not expensive to deploy. The challenge with that is again, they're concentrating and having a concentration of PFAS, which is better than having an unconcentrated PFAS, but those are the low-cost methods that can be employed. The cost of these other innovative technologies are being evaluated through the performance studies that are being utilized now as they're being deployed.
So Anne, this might be related, but can you speak to the current state of leachate pretreatment technology offering data on efficiency in filtering landfill toxins?
I don't know, I'm the best person to answer that.
Is there someone on the panel who could answer it?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. It asks panelists, if you can, to speak to the current state of leachate pretreatment technology, offering data on the efficacy of infiltrating landfill toxins. What are you thinking when you go,
Yeah, there's a number of studies out there that compare the cost of different treatment technologies. One that's particularly good is by another consultant, Brown and Caldwell. I believe it's available online, where they compare the cost and efficacy of different treatment systems. Just for comparison, to direct discharge to a wastewater treatment plant, which can't handle PFAS, it's like cents per gallon. Some of these other technologies, reverse osmosis, for example, can be close to 10 or more cents per gallon. And when we're talking about millions of gallons of leachate, it really adds up. So, but I would, I'll try to find this Brown Caldwell summary. And I thought Patel may have something as well to share with others about the relative cost and efficacy of treatment technologies.
Yeah, I will say, just to add on to that, the destruction technologies are 99.999%, effective in terms of the destruction capability. So just to give you a sense, I mean, that's the goal, is non-detect levels, certainly.
Well, it's so interesting. Anytime any of you recommend that there might be something to read about it, my mind does start to spin a little bit, because it takes a lot to be able to decode that information and put it into practical use.
Yeah, but that is why I refer to the ITRC documents, because it's really intended to boil down the information. It's segregated into topics, so it's kind of bite-sized pieces to be able to understand some of these. But you're correct, though. It's a challenging, complex topic.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
Rick.
Yeah, I was just going to offer too, is that a lot of the more advanced or exotic technologies are for destruction in particular, GAC and the other things we've described, common absorption, collection, they produce a concentrate. Just want to make this clear. Now you have really highly concentrated PFAS. We're taking it out of the environment, but then the destructive technologies available are really, well, for treatment technology, I'll say, are pilot scale. A lot of electrical based systems that they've proven that they're effective, like on a liters per day basis, not millions of gallons a day. So that's one of the obstacles that we have to overcome, is the scalability of these treatment systems and destroying, which Amy is referring to. Breaking the carbon fluorine bond is really, really expensive and takes a lot of energy.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to, just for a heads up, so Nick and Jay and Casey, in a moment, I'm going to spotlight your screen and bring you back up onto the stage too. But there are, comments in the chat about noticing that PFAS affects fish and fauna. It has a noticeable effect that people can see. And the question about what the short-term effect and the long-term effect is in humans, and trying to figure out, there's a question that came in earlier. Can we take comfort in the recent PFAS survey showing low levels? And just trying to figure out, I think people trying to figure out where to put their confidence. Do you have a reflection on that?
So in Michigan, we have done, like I think Rick had talked about, we have done an insane amount of surface water and fish sampling throughout the entire state, and all of that information is publicly available online for people to look at. And we have issued fish consumption advisories in various parts of the state due to PFAS. I will say that sometimes when you get the PFAS data back, the fish consumption advisory is being driven by things like PCBs and mercury. So, it's just another pollutant of concern that we have to contend with, as we do with mercury and PCBs in the fish that we eat. So again, Michigan is we do a lot of surface water sampling, and then we And then really that doesn't tell us a whole lot. It's really fish testing and sampling is actually more indicative of an industrial source within a watershed than ambient surface water sampling. So we do a whole host of fish tissue sampling for PFAS in Michigan. And we do have guidance documents on how to do that and whatnot on our website as well.
So Casey, Justin, and Nick, if you are available to join us for a couple of more questions, I'm not able to spotlight your video, but if you turn on your video, I think it will show up in people's gallery view. There we go. We only have a couple of minutes left, and I'm not going to ask you all to stay later than 9. It's a tall ask, and you've actually provided a lot already. There will be a recording of this video so that people could go back and see portions of it if they wished. And I know the MWA will also be posting any follow-up, like selected slides, the link to this video, and anything else that they might be able to follow up with to their website. So that's where folks, you can find some follow-up information. Let's take a question on air, and then we'll return to the chat for 1 or 2 more questions if we have time. And I see that Herbie or Ruby, I see that your hand is up. I'm going to ask you to unmute. Do you have a question for the panelists?
Yes. As a grandmother, would you consider Newport swimmable for young children? Would you put your child in that lake? Anybody?
Panelists.
I would say that if there's not foam present, the concentrations are pretty low. I'm not a toxicologist. I mean, nobody wants to be exposed to anything toxic, but given the size of the lake, the volume of water, and the relatively, what I understand is to be a minor discharge from the wastewater treatment plant, the health threat is pretty limited for direct contact.
I can follow up with some of the results from our recent, or some of the findings from our recent PFAS sampling study in Lake Memphremagog. In summer and fall 2021, DEC sampled surface waters from 10 sites in the Lake Memphremagog, and in the Lake Memphremagog Basin watershed. And from the 10 sites, only 2 PFAS were detected, and they reported that PFAS results were consistent with concentrations found in remote areas worldwide. They also did some fish tissue analysis, and they detected 3 PFAS at very low concentrations. And these PFAS were all well below the screening levels used to evaluate fish consumption risks. So I think that's good news. And this report is going to be coming out really soon. So I recommend that you check it out when it's released. We are in the process of finalizing the draft of the report, and I anticipate a draft being circulated sometime in February, and then finalization after that draft is reviewed internally. And so so that report's coming really soon, and I recommend checking that out.
And how do people find it, Nick? That might be an obvious question, but it wouldn't be to me. How would I find that report if I wanted to see it?
Yeah, so that report is going to be, so likely there will be a press release with that report where DEC will announce that we have this new report, and all of our PFAS reports are posted on our PFAS investigation webpage. So it will definitely be posted there. It'll also be posted on our Lake Memphremagog webpage, which talks about all of our water quality work in the Memphremagog Watershed. So those would be the 2 sites, and I'm happy to share those links.
I would just add and give another plug. I know Amy has done this, but the ITRC website does have a fact sheet about how humans are exposed to PFAS. And again, the incidental contact of swimming in a lake, that's not your primary pathway of being exposed to these chemicals. It's drinking contaminated water and eating contaminated fish. And so I would encourage people to check out the ITRC website and the fact sheets there. And so in Michigan, like I said, we have sampled a number of water bodies throughout the state, starting in 2011. And what our toxicologists consider, background or ambient levels of PFOS in our waterways is around 3 to 5 parts per trillion. That's where we sometimes see it and we don't consider there to be an industrial source nearby. Now, granted, we see non-detect, we see less than 2 parts per trillion, but oftentimes in industrialized areas in major cities, we'll see lakes, rivers, and streams with concentrations from 3 to 5 parts per trillion of PFOS. And that doesn't cause us to do a further PFAS investigation for an industrial source.
So the very super simplified answer is that the swimming in the lake is not where the body is getting its greatest exposure. And there is more information that's coming out specific to Lake Memphremagog, and it's going to be available shortly within the next couple of months and widely distributed, which would give you a little more specific information. So I'm going to move back to a general question and then it's closing comments because we are at that time of the night. And I thank you for everyone who submitted questions, and my apologies that we didn't get to all of them. So to step back and ask a more general one, any of you panelists, as people try to keep on top of what leachate is and try to meaningfully engage with this question about how it should be managed, what are some of the things that you're hoping people are paying attention to? And though some of the things should be short and memorable, if you possibly can, what are you hoping people pay attention to in this conversation?
I'll go that, I hope that, what in Michigan, we're trying to convey is that treating PFAS at an industrial source is the most cost-effective, environmentally effective way to ensure that PFAS is not going to your wastewater treatment plants and passing it on to your lakes, rivers, and streams.
And I'll add to that these destructive technologies that are now being fielded and scaled are ones that can treat those concentrated waste streams at the source. And they are showing promise that we can treat PFAS and destroy PFAS.
And I'll just chime in. There was a question directly sent to me from someone in the chat about, wouldn't it just be easier to ban PFAS products altogether? And that if we had a crystal ball and could do that 30, 40 years ago, that would have been great. I will say there is legislation at many different state levels and at federal levels as well to try and ban the use of PFAS in non-cooking ware, et cetera, chemicals. So that is another step that the federal government and states are trying to take as far as banning PFAS at its source altogether, so that it doesn't enter our waste streams and it's left on our lap to try and clean it up.
And Casey and Nick, you may be deferring people to look for that report when it comes out in terms of trying to condense a lot of information in a short space. Is there anything that you'd add before we close tonight?
I would just add that builds off of those 3 comments is this is an ongoing conversation. I thoroughly appreciate everyone being here and having had this conversation over the last several years that we've gotten to this point where now we're talking about the latest and greatest treatment technologies. If we're coming back and having this conversation in another 2 years, we're going to keep building and we're going to keep advancing what we're doing with leachate, how we're dealing with PFAS specifically, and how we're doing that here in Vermont.
Nick, anything to add? And then David Converse, I'm going to bring you back up for some closing comments, or Mary Pat. Nick?
Yeah, I would just add, thank you for asking me to participate on this panel. And, I love to see all the engagement and questions and interest and concern regarding Vermont's water quality, because it's of equal importance to me, and I'm sure our panelists as well. And, you know, when it comes to PFAS, I just think that source reduction is really, as Anne and Casey and other folks have mentioned, is really, you know, the most efficient and effective way that we can address this, you know, ubiquitous problem. And, you know, I think that's where we should be putting the basket we should be putting our egg is addressing those sources. And so Vermont's working on some really cool projects to do that, and keep an eye out for those, because we'll be releasing some of that information soon that looks at you know, PFAS and leachate, but also residential and commercial and other industrial sources.
Thank you so much, panelists. Mary Pat, I could hear you starting to break in. Did you want to say something, or David? But we'll just have to unmute. It's not super easy because I had you muted for so long.
Yeah.
All right, I didn't mean to break in. I just wanted to thank everybody. Bravo, you did a great job. And I hope that all of our audience appreciates everything that you've done. And hopefully we can catalog some of the questions that didn't get answered and pass them along to you. So thank you all very much.
Participants, thank you so much for hanging in with us. And we will now adjourn the meeting. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.